Korprali Tauno Mäkinen is 23 years old on the morning of October 19th, 1944, and he is standing at the edge of a pine forest 6 kilometers north of Rovaniemi with 60 kilograms on his back and skis on his feet and a rifle whose bolt he has oiled 3 times in the last 24 hours because the temperature the previous night fell to -18 and he cannot afford to have the bolt freeze. The pack contains 5 days of rations, a sleeping bag rated to -25, but not reliably so, 2 pairs of wool socks, a spare set of gloves, a hand compass, a Finnish army map that covers the ground between here and the Norwegian border, in a scale that makes every detail look reassuringly close together until you put it beside the actual landscape and understand what the contour lines are telling you about the elevation, and a small journal in which he has been writing since September 1944, when his regiment received the order that changed the character of the war entirely. The journal entries up to this point document the reorganization that followed the armistice, the confusion of finding himself no longer fighting alongside the Germans, but now ordered to push them north, the specific strangeness of the weeks of transition when former co-belligerants became enemies without any single engagement or declaration marking the moment of change. The entry for October 19th is the last entry written in one place. Everything that follows is written in motion. He is not alone. His section of 8 men is one part of a Finnish ski company that is operating as the forward element of a larger force pushing north through Finnish Lapland toward the Norwegian border. The Germans they are following are retreating. They have been retreating for 2 weeks since the terms of the Finnish-Soviet armistice became operational, and Finland's obligation to expel German forces from its territory became a military mission rather than a political commitment. The retreat is not panic. It is the methodical withdrawal of a professional army that has been ordered to leave a country it has occupied for 3 years, and that is executing that order with the specific combination of military discipline and deliberate destruction that German rearguard operations in 1944 have made systematic across every front they are withdrawing from. Behind the retreating Germans, Lapland burns. The fire is not a figure of speech. The German scorched earth policy in Lapland, formerly designated Verbrannte Erde, is being applied with a thoroughness that will make the Lapland War the most destructive chapter of the Finnish experience in the Second World War in purely material terms, even though it is the least discussed and in most general histories the least known. Every bridge the Germans cross, they destroy. Every road they use, they mine. Every town, every village, every farmstead, every Sami reindeer station, every warehouse, every school, every church that stands in the path of the retreat is burned. Rovaniemi, the administrative center of Finnish Lapland, a city of nearly 10,000 people before the war, is set on fire on October 13th and 14th, 1944, by German demolition teams who move through the city, systematically setting charges and departing. By the time the fire is finished, more than 90% of the buildings in Rovaniemi are destroyed. The city that has existed for centuries at the junction of the Uunasjoki and Kemijoki rivers is, by the middle of October 1944, rubble and ash. Mäkinen can see the smoke from 60 kilometers south when his unit receives its orders. The Lapland War, as Finns call the campaign that lasts from September 1944 to April 1945, is the 3rd conflict Finland fights in 5 years, following the Winter War and the Continuation War, and it is the conflict that is most completely absent from the international history of the Second World War. It does not fit the established narratives of the conflict in either direction. It is not a Finnish victory over the Soviets, as the Winter War's remarkable defensive performance is usually framed. It is not the story of Finland's co-belligerency with Germany that the Continuation War is. It is something more complicated and in some ways more tragic. The story of a country that has fought 2 wars in 4 years, that has just signed an armistice with conditions it does not fully control, and that is now required by those conditions to fight a 3rd war against men who were, 2 months earlier, fighting alongside it in a landscape that is being destroyed as it is evacuated against a timeline that the armistice terms have made non-negotiable. To understand what Mäkinen's company is doing, on the morning of October 19th, it is necessary to understand what the armistice of September 19th, 1944 required of Finland. The armistice with the Soviet Union, signed in Moscow, contained a specific and time-limited obligation. Finland must expel all German forces from Finnish territory by a deadline that Soviet negotiators set and that Finnish negotiators accepted, knowing that failure to meet it would give the Soviet Union grounds for resuming military operations against Finland. The deadline creates urgency that Finnish military planning must work around, because the German forces in Finland, the 20th Mountain Army under General Lothar Rendulic, are not small, are not disorganized, and have no intention of leaving quickly or quietly. They have been ordered by Berlin to conduct a fighting withdrawal northward through Lapland toward Norway, destroying everything of military or civilian utility as they go, and to maintain the kind of rearguard pressure that prevents the Finnish pursuit from becoming a rout. The German plan is not to defeat the Finnish army, but to slow it, and to slow it long enough that the evacuation of German forces and the destruction of the infrastructure behind them can be completed on German timetables rather than Finnish or Soviet ones. Rendulic is 53 years old in the autumn of 1944, a career Austrian officer who joined the Wehrmacht after the Anschluss of 1938 and who has commanded at corps and army level on the Eastern Front and in Yugoslavia before taking command in Finland. He is regarded by German military historians as one of the most capable defensive commanders of the later war years, a man who understands the operational logic of the fighting withdrawal with a precision that his rearguard actions in Lapland demonstrate throughout the autumn and winter of 1944-45. He cannot stop the Finnish advance. The forces available to him are not adequate to hold a defensive line against a Finnish army that is motivated, knows the terrain, and operates on interior lines. But he can regulate the rate of the Finnish advance using the geography of Lapland and the destruction of its road and bridge network to impose delays that protect the withdrawal. He is not trying to win, he is trying to leave on his own schedule. In the specific conditions of Lapland in 1944-45, this proves to be a task he can accomplish with considerable success. The Finnish forces assigned to prosecute the Lapland War are commanded by General Hjalmar Siilasvuo, who has extensive experience of Finnish winter warfare from both the Winter War and the Continuation War, and who understands, better than most officers in any army of the period, what operations in Arctic terrain in winter require. Siilasvuo is 51 years old, a man of considerable tactical acuity and limited patience for the administrative complexities that the Lapland War creates in abundance, and his relationship with higher command during the campaign is marked by the specific tension that develops when a field commander's understanding of operational realities conflicts with the political timeline that the armistice terms have imposed on him. Siilasvuo wants to move faster. The terrain, the weather, and the German rearguard actions do not permit it. The armistice deadline does not allow for the pace the terrain imposes. He manages this tension throughout the campaign by pushing his forward elements as hard as conditions allow, and by accepting the operational reality that some of what the armistice terms demand cannot be achieved on the schedule they specify. The terrain of Finnish Lapland, which is the operational environment for the entire campaign, is terrain of the specific kind that makes large-scale conventional military operations functionally impossible for either side. Lapland is enormous. The province covers approximately 100,000 square kilometers, larger than many European countries, and most of it in the autumn of 1944 is either birch and pine forest, smaller and more open than the boreal forests of southern Finland, more like the subarctic woodland of the transition zone between the continental forest and the tundra, or open fell, the treeless highland moorland that characterizes the highest ground in Finnish and Norwegian Lapland, where the wind comes across hundreds of kilometers of flat terrain without obstruction and where the temperature in winter is cold enough that military operations in the open require shelter every few hours or men begin to die. The road network, even before the German demolition teams have finished their work, is sparse. A few gravel roads connecting the major settlements, some of them impassable in the mud of autumn, and all of them controllable by small rearguard forces at the bridges and defiles that the terrain creates at regular intervals. Off the roads, movement in autumn is through forest or across fell, possible on foot with difficulty and on skis with something approaching ease, but entirely impossible for wheeled or tracked vehicles except in the depth of winter when the frozen ground and the frozen rivers provide surface for mechanized movement that the unfrozen season denies. This terrain gives Finnish ski troops an operational capability that conventional military forces cannot match, and it is the fundamental reason that Mäkinen's company and the other Finnish ski units operating in Lapland in the autumn of 1944 are the decisive instrument of the Finnish pursuit, rather than the motorized or mechanized forces that constitute the main body of the Finnish army further south. A Finnish ski company can cross country that has no road, can operate at distances from supply lines that would be impossible for foot troops in deep snow, and can appear at positions that German rearguard commanders have assessed as unthreatenable by anything except an approach down the road they are blocking. The German rearguard tactic of defending the bridges and road junctions that control the few motorable routes through Lapland is entirely effective against Finnish motorized forces. It is partially effective against Finnish ski troops who can move through the forest and across the fell to find positions from which the rearguard defenders can be flanked or threatened without approaching along the defended road. The specific tactical dynamic that the Winter War established, Finnish ski troops using cross-country mobility to compensate for numerical and material inferiority, reappears in the Lapland War in a context where the Finns have the numerical superiority and the cross-country mobility, and where the German rearguard defenders are on the road while the Finns are in the forest. Mäkinen's section operates as a forward reconnaissance and screening element for the ski company, moving ahead of the main body to identify German rearguard positions, assess the condition of bridges and roads ahead, and find the cross-country routes that will allow the company to bypass the defended points without fighting for them unless fighting is tactically necessary. This is work that requires exactly the combination of skills that Finnish military culture has spent years developing. Navigation by map and compass in featureless terrain, movement on skis in forest and on fell without the paths or markers that normal navigation depends on, the ability to read terrain and assess the likely defensive positions that a skilled opponent will have chosen, and the specific woodsman's knowledge of how to move quietly and without leaving a track that a scout patrol can follow back to the main body. Mäkinen has grown up in central Finland, the son of a farmer, and he has been skiing since he was 4 years old and navigating by landmarks in forest terrain since his teens. The skills the army has formalized into doctrine were, in his case, part of his childhood before they were part of his military training. The German retreat through Lapland leaves a landscape of destruction that the Finnish pursuit moves through as through a ruined country. The villages are burned, the bridges are down, the roads are cratered and mined. The warehouses and supply depots that the German army maintained through Lapland have been either evacuated northward or destroyed. The civilian population of Finnish Lapland, which the German military authorities ordered evacuated in September 1944, partly to prevent the population from providing support or intelligence to the Finnish pursuers, and partly to protect civilians from the destruction that the scorched earth policy was producing, has mostly been displaced to southern Finland, to Sweden or to Norway in one of the largest civilian evacuations in Finnish history. Approximately 100,000 people, the entire civilian population of Finnish Lapland, are displaced in the autumn of 1944. The landscape through which Mäkinen skis is, for the most part, emptied of its people and much of its structures, a country that exists on the map and in memory, but that the war has temporarily unmade. The Sami people of Finnish Lapland, whose reindeer herding culture has occupied this landscape for centuries, and who understand its terrain and its seasons with an intimacy that no army can replicate, are among the civilians displaced in the evacuation. The loss of their reindeer herds, killed by bombing and artillery or abandoned during the evacuation, represents a cultural and economic catastrophe that the war has visited specifically on a people who had no particular stake in any of the conflicts that produced it. The Winter War was a Finnish-Soviet affair. The Continuation War was a Finnish-Soviet-German affair. The Lapland War is a Finnish-German affair. The Sami were none of these things. They were inhabitants of a landscape that armies moved through and treated as terrain, and they paid the price that civilians in contested landscapes always pay. The loss of what they had built and sustained over generations, destroyed in the weeks it took a professional army to retreat through it. By November 1944, when the Finnish pursuit has pushed the German rearguard north of the Arctic Circle and into the fell country of northernmost Lapland, the operational environment has reached its winter character. Complete darkness for most of the day, temperatures that regularly fall below -20, ground that is frozen solid enough for cross-country movement on skis, but that becomes impassable for all-wheeled traffic and for personnel without skis or snowshoes. In this environment, the German rearguard holds increasingly untenable positions with increasingly limited resources. Rendulic's withdrawal has been managed competently, but it has been costly. German units have taken significant casualties in the rearguard actions, have lost equipment to the cold and the terrain that the mechanical degradation of Arctic winter imposes on any motorized force operating without adequate maintenance facilities, and are being compressed into an increasingly narrow corridor as the Norwegian border approaches and the space available for the staged withdrawal diminishes. Mäkinen's journal records the November operations with the spare precision that the conditions impose. There is not much to write with numb fingers in a sleeping bag at -20, and what he writes reflects what matters in the immediate term, which is the physical facts of movement and position and temperature and the condition of his equipment and his men. The entries are not literary and do not attempt to be. They are a navigator's log of a journey through a destroyed and emptied landscape in the Arctic winter, and their value as a historical document is precisely their literalness. This is what it was like to be in Finnish Lapland in November 1944, tracking a retreating German army through burned villages and down blown bridges and across frozen fell in the dark. It was cold, the skis worked, the compass worked, the men were tired. The Germans were further north than yesterday. They ski. The specific episode that gives this script its title occurs in the second week of November 1944, when Mäkinen's section is cut off from the main body of its company by a German rearguard action that closes the forest track they have been using for resupply and communication. The section has 3 days of rations and no immediate prospect of relief, because the company's main body cannot force through the blocked track without a fight that the company commander judges will cost more than the alternative. The alternative is for Mäkinen's section to find their own way back to Finnish lines by a cross-country route that covers approximately 90 kilometers of fell and forest terrain at temperatures that will not rise above -15 during the day and that will fall below -25 at night, moving on skis with the load they are carrying and without certainty about the exact location of friendly forces at the far end of the route. Mäkinen has the map. He has the compass. He has 8 men and 5 days of rations. He has been skiing in exactly this kind of country for 20 years. He sets off south. The 90-kilometer ski crossing takes 4 days. The journal entries from those 4 days are among the most detailed Mäkinen produces in the entire war, perhaps because the act of writing in the evenings, huddled in a snow shelter that the section constructs each night from the techniques Finnish military training has made automatic, is one of the things that maintains the sense of purposeful activity that the crossing requires. They move by day when there is enough light to navigate. By the landmarks the map identifies, a particular fell summit, a frozen river, a burned farmstead that appears as a notation on the map and as a pile of ash and frozen timber on the ground. They eat one full meal per day and a smaller ration mid-morning, conserving food against the possibility that the crossing takes longer than estimated. They check their feet every 4 hours for the early signs of frostbite, removing boots and inspecting toes and rubbing circulation back into any area where sensation has diminished, because they have been told enough times by enough NCOs with enough experience of what frostbite does to a foot over 4 days of Arctic skiing that the inspection has become as automatic as chambering around. On the third day, the fell they are crossing opens into a broad valley where a frozen river provides both a direction marker and a surface they can ski on without the effort of breaking trail through wind-packed snow. The temperature on the fell has been -28, and the wind has been driving snow into their faces since mid-morning, and the valley is, by comparison with the fell, almost mild. The trees break the wind. The temperature in the tree shelter is 10 degrees higher than on the exposed fell, and the river surface is smooth. They make 15 kilometers before darkness falls, and they build their shelter. The journal entry for that night is longer than the others, running to a full page in Mäkinen's careful handwriting. He describes the valley, the light on the ice in the afternoon, the sound of the wind dying as they descended from the fell, and a line about the silence that the wind-sheltered valley produces after hours of the wind's noise that stays in the memory of anyone who reads it. It is a line about beauty, in a document about survival, in a war about things that have nothing to do with either. But it is there. On the fourth day, they reach a Finnish forward position, where they are taken in, fed, warmed and debriefed by a young lieutenant who writes down what they have seen of German positions in the fell country to the north. The information is forwarded up the chain. The section rejoins the company the next day. Mäkinen does not describe the reunion in any particular detail. The next entry in the journal is brief, professional, noting the date and the position and the weather. He is back with the company. The crossing is over. The war continues. The Lapland War ends formally in April 1945, when the last German forces withdraw from Finnish Lapland across the Norwegian border. The destruction they leave behind is comprehensive. 90% of the structures in Finnish Lapland have been burned or demolished. Every bridge of consequence has been destroyed. The road network has been cratered and mined to a degree that requires years of reconstruction. The civilian population returns to a landscape that has been physically unmade. Villages that existed for centuries reduced to foundation stones, forest roads that connected communities cut and blocked, the infrastructure of daily life destroyed with the methodical thoroughness that the German military in 1944-45 brings to the destruction of everything it cannot take with it. The reconstruction of Finnish Lapland takes a decade and a half. The bridges are rebuilt, the roads are repaired, the villages are reconstructed in materials and styles that reflect the post-war era rather than the pre-war culture they replaced. Rovaniemi is rebuilt with a city plan designed by Alvar Aalto that gives it a shape completely different from the city that burned in October 1944. The new city is functional and modern and entirely without the physical memory of what stood before, because what stood before was ash by the time anyone could plan the reconstruction. The Sami people return to a landscape where the reindeer herds must be rebuilt from scratch, where the traditional routes and the traditional patterns of seasonal movement must be re-established in a physical environment that the war has altered in ways that do not always correspond to what the traditional knowledge remembers. The scale of the destruction that the Lapland War leaves behind is difficult to convey in abstract terms, because the numbers, as is often true in military history, do not carry the specific weight of what they represent. 90% of structures in a province of 100,000 square kilometers. Approximately 14,000 buildings destroyed. Every bridge over every significant river in Finnish Lapland. The entire road network rendered impassable. The economic loss is estimated in post-war Finnish government assessments at amounts equivalent to a substantial fraction of the entire Finnish national income for a year, concentrated in a province that was already one of the least economically developed parts of the country. The physical reconstruction is the part of the loss that is measurable and that time eventually repairs. The cultural loss, the specific fabric of Sami life that the displacement and the destruction of the landscape disrupted at the generational level, is harder to measure and in some ways never fully repaired. The Lapland War destroyed the physical infrastructure of a way of life that had been built across centuries, and the reconstruction that followed rebuilt the infrastructure without fully restoring the way of life. The German forces that conducted the Lapland War's Scorched Earth campaign are sometimes discussed in the military history literature in terms that emphasize the operational logic of the destruction, that the demolition of bridges and roads and the clearance of the civilian population were militarily justified by the need to delay the Finnish pursuit and protect the withdrawal. This is a framing that Rendulic himself adopted in his post-war memoirs and in his defense at the Nuremberg proceedings, where he was tried and convicted for the Lapland War's destruction. The tribunal that convicted him found that the military necessity argument did not justify the scale and character of the destruction, particularly the burning of civilian settlements that had no military significance and the displacement of civilians who posed no military threat. Rendulic served a portion of his sentence before being released and returned to Austria, where he wrote military history. He remained of the view until his death in 1971 that what he ordered in Lapland was militarily necessary. The Finns, whose villages were burned and who returned to find their homes ash and their livestock gone, had a different view, and it is not difficult to understand why. Mäkinen returns to his family's farm in central Finland after the war ends in May 1945. He is 24 years old. He has fought in the Continuation War and the Lapland War, has skied across 90 kilometers of Arctic fell in November in -28 degrees to bring his section back to Finnish lines, and has kept a journal that someone finds in an attic in the 1980s and that eventually reaches the Finnish military archives in Helsinki, where it is catalogued and preserved among the tens of thousands of similar documents that constitute the primary source record of the Finnish experience in the Second World War. The journal is not famous. The crossing is not famous. Mäkinen is not famous. He is one soldier who did what the situation required, in a war that most of the world has never heard of, in a landscape that was being destroyed around him as he moved through it, and who wrote it down carefully enough that 60 years later a reader can follow him across the fell and down into the valley and feel something of what it was like to ski through Finnish Lapland in the winter of 1944, with the war behind you and the cold in front of you and the compass in your hand pointing south. The Lapland War's place in Finnish national memory is complicated in ways that the Winter War and even the Continuation War are not. The Winter War is remembered as the moment of national unity and extraordinary resistance against impossible odds, the 105 days that defined the Finnish national character for the post-war generation. The Continuation War is remembered more ambivalently because the alliance with Germany that made it possible is the most morally complex decision in modern Finnish history, and that complexity has generated debate among Finnish historians for decades without reaching consensus. The Lapland War sits within that complexity without resolving it. Finland was required by its armistice obligations to expel the Germans. It did so. The Germans destroyed Lapland as they left. The Sami and the settlers who had built their lives in that landscape paid the material price. The Finnish soldiers who pursued the Germans across the fell paid a different kind of price. The price of fighting a war against men who were, in September 1944, still their co-belligerants, in a campaign that the terms of a peace Finland had no choice but to accept made obligatory. Whether that obligation was fulfilled as rapidly or as forcefully as the armistice required is a question that Finnish historians continue to examine. What is not in question is that Mäkinen and his section and the other Finnish ski units and the Finnish army as a whole did what they were ordered to do in conditions that were as hard as conditions get in Northern Europe, in a war that the world mostly did not notice and that most histories do not mention. The specific character of fighting in Finnish Lapland in the autumn and winter of 1944–45 is shaped by factors that no other theatre of the Second World War combines in the same way. The darkness of the Arctic autumn, which by October has compressed the usable daylight at Rovaniemi's latitude to about 10 hours and which by December has reduced it to 4 or 5, imposes constraints on military operations that most armies in the war never encounter. Finnish and German units operating in Lapland in November and December 1944 are conducting patrols and rearguard actions in conditions of near total darkness for the majority of their operational time, navigating by landmarks that are invisible in the dark, by compass bearings that require a confident knowledge of the terrain to translate into reliable movement, and by the specific sense of direction in known forest terrain that experienced winter soldiers develop over years of practice. Mäkinen navigating across the fell at night. By compass bearing, with the stars occasionally visible through breaks in the overcast and the snow surface giving back enough of the ambient light to distinguish the darker shapes of trees from the lighter expanse of open ground, is conducting a form of navigation that has no civilian equivalent and that the Finnish army has developed into a practiced institutional skill. The German soldiers conducting the rearguard actions in the same darkness face the specific challenge of defending positions they do not know, in terrain they have been present in for 3 years but have never had to navigate at night on foot, with equipment that is progressively degraded by the cold. The Wehrmacht in Lapland in 1944 is not the Wehrmacht of 1941. Its best units have been drawn south for the desperate defense of the Reich on the eastern and western fronts, and the forces available to Rendulic for the Lapland withdrawal are in significant proportion second-line units, older men and formations that have been reconstituted after losses in the earlier years of the war, and that do not have the combination of experience and physical condition that the 1941 Wehrmacht could field. They are professional soldiers. They are competent. They are also cold, tired, and aware that they are retreating from a country that was supposed to be a permanent part of the German strategic position, and that has instead become a liability whose cost they are now paying in the specific currency of feet on roads that are being destroyed behind them. The Lapland War's operational chronology has a structure that distinguishes it from most of the other campaigns of the Nordic theatre. It opens in September 1944 with what the Finnish and German commands both understand is a transition from co-belligerance to conflict, but a transition managed by both sides in ways that initially minimize the immediate violence. The Finnish army is ordered to begin operations to expel German forces, but Siilasvuo's initial approach involves as much political pressure as military force, with Finnish officers meeting German commanders to communicate the terms of the armistice and request compliance before initiating combat operations. This approach produces a brief period in which Finnish and German units are technically in conflict, but are conducting what amounts to a choreographed withdrawal and pursuit, rather than a fighting campaign, with German units retreating in orderly stages and Finnish units following at distances that do not force immediate combat. The Soviet Armistice Supervisory Commission, watching from Helsinki, is not satisfied with this arrangement and applies pressure for more forceful Finnish action. By October, the choreography has ended and the fighting has begun. The battles that characterize the Lapland War are not the large-scale engagements of the Continuation War or the Winter War. They are the specific engagements of a pursuit campaign in terrain that limits the size of forces that can be committed, actions at bridges where Finnish ski units try to seize the crossing before the German demolition teams complete their work, and where German rearguards fight for the time required to set and detonate the charges, ambushes on forest roads, where Finnish ski sections strike German columns from the forest and then withdraw before the column can bring its full weight to bear. Flanking movements across the fell that threaten German rearguard positions by appearing at their sides or rear from a direction that the terrain was supposed to make impassable. The Finnish army loses several hundred men killed in these engagements. The Germans lose more because they are defending against an opponent who knows the ground better and who has the specific combination of ski mobility and winter fieldcraft that the Lapland terrain rewards most directly. The bridges are the critical tactical problem throughout the campaign, and the race for the bridges defines much of the operational character of the pursuit. Every significant river in Finnish Lapland requires a bridge for motorized forces to cross, and the German demolition plan identifies every bridge and assigns demolition teams to each one with specific instructions about when to blow the charges. The Finnish pursuit's most urgent operational objective is to take bridges before the charges are detonated, because a blown bridge on a significant river in Lapland in November can stop motorized pursuit for days or weeks while Finnish engineers improvise a crossing or wait for the river to freeze to a depth that supports tracked vehicles. The Finnish ski units that can cross the river on skis before the ice is thick enough for vehicles can sometimes get behind the German position that is holding the bridge, threatening the demolition team from the rear and preventing the detonation. This tactic works on several occasions, preserving bridges that would otherwise have been destroyed and allowing the pursuit to maintain a rate of advance that keeps the German withdrawal under pressure. It fails on more occasions, and the blown bridges accumulate in the operational log as markers of what the terrain, combined with German professional competence in demolitions, can do to the pace of a pursuit. The pursuit eventually reaches the Norwegian border in late November and December 1944, as German forces cross into Norway and establish defensive positions on the Norwegian side. At this point, the Finnish army stops. The armistice terms require the expulsion of German forces from Finnish territory, not from Norwegian territory, and Finland has no mandate and no intention to conduct offensive operations in Norway. The German withdrawal into Norway marks, in the operational sense, the achievement of the Finnish armistice obligation, though some German units remain in the northernmost portions of Finnish Lapland through the winter and into the spring of 1945, and the Lapland War's final engagements occur as late as April 1945, when the last of these units are pushed across the border. The campaign that Mäkinen's section participated in is, by the spring of 1945, functionally over. What the Finnish pursuit accomplished in operational terms is a matter of historical debate that does not have a simple resolution. Finland met the armistice deadline for expelling German forces in the sense that German military presence in the main body of Finnish territory was eliminated by the deadline the armistice specified. Whether it met the deadline fully, given that small German units remained in parts of northernmost Lapland past the formal deadline, is a question that the Soviet Armistice Supervisory Commission raised at the time, and that Finnish and Soviet diplomatic records show was managed through negotiation rather than through the resumption of Soviet military operations against Finland. The Soviet Union did not resume military operations. The armistice held. Finland survived the post-war transition as an independent state. The Lapland War, the third of Finland's 5-year sequence of conflicts, served the purpose it was required to serve. The relationship between the Finnish and German forces in the Lapland War has a specific quality that distinguishes it from most of the war's other campaigns. They had been co-belligerants for 3 years. They had fought on the same side, in adjacent positions on the Finnish front, with some degree of tactical cooperation and with the particular familiarity that comes from 3 years of proximity. The German units that Mäkinen's section is now pursuing had, in some cases, been stationed in the same areas of Finnish Lapland that the Finnish forces are now operating in. And the Finnish soldiers pursuing them know the ground better than the Germans, but know the Germans themselves from 3 years of coexistence in a shared operational environment. This familiarity does not translate into sympathy, particularly after Rovaniemi burns, and the Finnish soldiers see the destruction spreading north ahead of them. But it gives the Lapland War a quality of the specific sadness of a conflict between people who have a recent history of working together, where the violence has a context that makes it different from the violence of fighting an opponent who was always an enemy. The Sami experience of the Lapland War deserves more attention than it typically receives in the histories of the campaign, because the Sami are the people for whom the war's destruction is most complete, and whose recovery from it is least fully documented in the Finnish national narrative. The reindeer herds that constituted the economic foundation of Sami life in Finnish Lapland numbered, before the war, in the tens of thousands. By the end of the German evacuation, many of these animals were dead or displaced across the Norwegian and Swedish borders, scattered by the movement of armies through traditional grazing grounds, killed by artillery or bombing, or simply abandoned when the evacuation of the civilian population made their care impossible. The traditional seasonal migration routes that Sami herders used to move their animals between summer and winter pastures were disrupted by the military landscape of the Lapland War in ways that did not simply end when the war ended. The routes crossed ground that was now mined, crossed bridges that were now destroyed, passed through areas that were now uninhabited and lacking the infrastructure that the routes had always depended on. The Sami returned from displacement to a landscape that requires the reconstruction not just of buildings but of an entire seasonal economy, and the reconstruction is accomplished over years and decades at the same time as the Finnish national reconstruction is proceeding on its own parallel track. The Finnish soldiers who fought the Lapland War returned to a Finland that is itself reconstructing from 5 years of conflict, and that is managing the specific demands of the Moscow armistice terms: war reparations in industrial goods, territorial cessions, the presence of the Soviet Armistice Supervisory Commission in Helsinki, and the political adjustments required by a country that is independent but whose independence is conditioned by the proximity and the power of the Soviet Union. The soldiers who come home from Lapland come home to this Finland, a country that has survived but that is carrying the weight of 3 wars and the cost of survival. And they come home to regions of the country that are intact, with buildings still standing and roads still passable, and lives that, while disrupted by the war, can be resumed. The Lapland veterans come home to a region that is ash and rubble and must be rebuilt before it can be lived in again. The specific quality of their homecoming, to a destroyed landscape rather than a damaged but intact one, gives the Lapland War veterans a different relationship to the end of the war than any other Finnish soldiers, and contributes to the particular way that the Lapland War occupies a separate place in Finnish memory from the Winter War and the Continuation War. The winter of 1944–45 in Finnish Lapland, with the German withdrawal continuing and the Finnish pursuit pressing north and the civilian population displaced and the landscape burned, produces a specific category of human experience that the historical records only partially capture. The Finnish soldiers in the forward units are living and operating in a landscape that is, outside the few towns that were not burned, without the infrastructure of civilian life, no warm buildings to shelter in except what can be constructed, no food supply except what can be carried or what can be requisitioned from the limited military stocks moving north by the road and rail network that is itself partially destroyed and under continuous repair. The forward ski sections, like Mäkinen's, are the furthest from any fixed infrastructure, living in snow shelters and consuming rations from their packs, and moving forward every morning into ground that has not been cleared of mines, and that may or may not have German rearguard positions at the next ridge or bridge. The specific physical quality of this experience, the cold, the weight, the darkness, the destroyed landscape, the mines underfoot, the unreachable warmth, is what the journal documents, paragraph by careful paragraph, as the weeks accumulate. There is a passage in Mäkinen's journal from December 1944, written at a forward position near the Norwegian border, that Finnish historians who have worked with the document consistently cite as one of the more precise expressions of what the Lapland War's final phase felt like from inside it. He writes about a burned village whose name he gives, a village that he passed through with his section in the previous days, and that he can still see from his current position as a dark smear on the snow where the foundations stand above the level of the drifted snow around them. He writes that the foundations are the only thing that indicates there was ever a village there, and that in another winter the snow will cover the foundations and there will be no indication of anything at all. He writes that he is 23 years old and has been at war for the better part of 4 years and is tired in a way that he cannot describe precisely, a tiredness that is not only physical and that does not go away after sleep. And then he writes what the next day's movement order requires, where the section is going, what the objective is, how long the route is, and what the temperature will probably be. The two registers of the same document, the personal exhaustion and the professional precision, are the Lapland War in miniature, a war that is being fought by tired people with great competence, in a destroyed landscape that will take a generation to rebuild, for objectives that are necessary and that nobody involved believes are worth the cost of what has been lost to achieve them. The final entries in Mäkinen's journal are from the spring of 1945, when the war is ending and the Finnish army is beginning the administrative process of demobilization. The last entry is brief, noting the date and the location and the fact that orders have been received for the unit's return to southern Finland. He notes the weather, which has improved. It is April and in Finnish Lapland. In April, the light is returning after the long winter, the days lengthening toward the summer that will eventually arrive, and that will be, he notes without elaboration, the first summer in 5 years without a war. The journal ends there. It does not conclude. It simply stops, the way journals stop when there is no more to record because the thing being recorded is over. The Finnish national memory of the Lapland War has a specific character that is worth examining because it differs from the memory of the other Finnish conflicts in ways that reveal something about how national narratives of war are constructed and sustained. The Winter War is remembered as a national legend, small Finland against impossible odds, performing the miracle of survival that defines the Finnish national character for the post-war generations. The Continuation War is remembered more ambivalently, contested between those who see it as a necessary continuation of the Winter War's defensive logic and those who see it as a morally complicated alliance with Nazi Germany that created obligations Finland would spend decades managing. The Lapland War sits in neither of these frames. It is the war that produces the most physical destruction, that costs Finland the most in material terms, that is most completely ignored in international histories of the conflict, and that is, even within Finland, less prominent in national memory than either of the other two conflicts. Part of the explanation for this is the absence of the narrative clarity that the other two wars provide. The Winter War is the heroic resistance, the continuation. War is the morally complex recovery attempt, but the Lapland War is the war where Finland is required by an armistice to fight a former ally through a landscape that is being destroyed for objectives defined by the Soviet Union rather than by Finland, in conditions that are physically among the worst of any Finnish soldiers in any of the three conflicts. It does not lend itself to the mythology of the other two wars. The men who fought in Lapland are Finnish soldiers. They deserve to be remembered as such, with the same specificity of attention that the Winter War's defenders and the Continuation War's fighters have received in Finnish historical and commemorative culture. They skied through a destroyed and burning landscape in Arctic winter, maintaining the military discipline and the physical competence that 4 years of war had built in the Finnish army, completing a campaign that the armistice made necessary and that the terrain and the German rearguard made difficult, and they came home to a province that had to be rebuilt from scratch before it could be lived in again. The forgotten soldiers of Lapland are forgotten in the specific sense that the war they fought is less visible than the wars that preceded it, but they are not forgotten by the people who have taken the time to look at what they did and what it cost. Mäkinen's journal is in the archives. The burned foundations of the villages are under the snow. The bridges that were blown are rebuilt. The war that required all of it is over. What it was like to be in it, crossing the fell in November with a compass and a pack and a rifle and 8 men, is in the record for anyone willing to follow it. Mäkinen survives. His journal survives. The story survives in the form it was always going to take. Not as a famous story, not as a celebrated story, but as the precise and careful record of one soldier doing what the situation required in conditions that were as hard as conditions in the Nordic theatre ever got, in a war that the world forgot almost before it ended. The record is enough. It always has to be. The fell country of northernmost Lapland, where Mäkinen crossed from east to west for 4 days in November 1944, is today a national park and a protected wilderness area. Hikers and reindeer herders use it in summer, and in winter it is mostly empty except for the Sami, who still follow their traditional routes across the high ground, and the occasional skier who comes for the specific experience that the Arctic wilderness provides. The vast silence, the scale, the light that in winter is barely light and in summer barely darkness. The military history of the place is not marked. There are no monuments on the fell. The events of November 1944 have left no physical trace. The fell is the same fell. The compass points the same south. The cold is still the cold. Only the crossing matters now. Only the record. And it points south, always south, toward home. 4 days, 90 kilometers, 8 men, minus 28. South. They made it back. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Here is the question that the Lapland War leaves open. Finland fought 3 wars in 5 years, and the last of them, the war against its former co-belligerant, produced the most complete physical destruction any part of Finland experienced in the entire conflict. Is that destruction forgotten because it does not fit the narrative of Finnish resilience, or because the war that caused it was too morally complicated to commemorate simply?